Welcome to Conspiracy Theories and Cover-Ups. I'm your host, Ben Carter, and in today's episode, we're uncovering a theory that refuses to die. The possibility that Adolf Hitler did not perish in a Berlin bunker in 1945, but instead escaped to South America, living out his days far from justice. Official history claims he died by suicide, but over the decades, whispers, documents, and sightings have painted a radically different picture. Today, we trace the shadowy trail of the Nazi flight theory and what may lie behind the curtain of official accounts. In the final months of World War II, as Allied forces closed in from all directions, Berlin was on the verge of collapse. Adolf Hitler, long considered the mastermind of Nazi Germany's brutal reign, had retreated deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, taking refuge in the Führer bunker. With defeat imminent, the Nazi regime began to fracture. Key figures scattered, loyalties shifted, and destruction rained down on the German capital. According to official records, on April 30, 1945, Hitler and his longtime companion Eva Braun died by suicide in that underground chamber. Their bodies were allegedly burned in the garden above and recovered in fragments by Soviet forces. But the end of Hitler was never as clear-cut as the story suggested. Stalin's Soviet Union, which had been the first to gain access to the bunker ruins, refused to offer definitive proof of Hitler's death. Instead, Soviet officials sent conflicting reports to the West. Some claimed the body had been identified, others suggested it was never found at all. In the fog of war and its aftermath, a vacuum of certainty formed, and into that vacuum poured rumor, doubt, and a narrative that would persist for decades. In the post-war years, as the Cold War deepened, information from Soviet sources remained tightly controlled. Western intelligence agencies, including the newly formed CIA, began to receive reports from across the globe. Witnesses in Latin America claimed to have seen a man resembling Hitler. Some said he was living in a German colony in Argentina. Others claimed he had been spotted in Brazil or Chile. The FBI even opened multiple case files, some heavily redacted, detailing alleged sightings and tip-offs that placed Hitler thousands of miles from where history claimed he died. Adding fuel to the fire was the well-documented escape of other high-ranking Nazis. The so-called rat lines, secret escape routes aided by sympathizers and Catholic clergy, enabled figures like Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele to flee to South America. Eichmann was captured in Argentina in 1960. Mengele lived in Brazil until his death in 1979. If they could escape, why not Hitler? Argentina, in particular, became a focal point. Under President Juan Perón, a known admirer of fascist regimes, the country welcomed many former Nazis and their collaborators. German enclaves thrived in rural areas. Towns like Bariloche were known for their alpine architecture, German-language schools, and suspiciously insular communities. These settlements became the backdrop of countless theories and supposed sightings. This atmosphere, already charged with uncertainty, created fertile ground for more than just rumors. Over the years, authors, journalists, and amateur sleuths uncovered trails, photographs, testimonies, even buildings allegedly constructed for the Führer's second life. And while mainstream historians dismissed the claims as baseless or sensational, the persistence of these stories, bolstered by partially declassified intelligence documents, kept the question alive. Did Hitler really die in 1945, or did he vanish into the vast, anonymous reaches of post-war South America? The end of World War II left Europe in ruins. Millions were displaced, cities were reduced to rubble, and the geopolitical landscape had been turned upside down. Amid the chaos, the victorious Allied powers began rebuilding and dividing territories, while behind the scenes, a different kind of operation was taking shape, one that involved the tracking, apprehension, and in some cases, quiet assimilation of Nazi war criminals. The Nuremberg trials would bring several high-ranking Nazis to justice, but many others disappeared without a trace. The phenomenon of Nazi fugitives escaping justice wasn't just theoretical, it was a documented fact. Operation Paperclip, a secret US intelligence program, brought over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States, many of whom had worked directly for the Nazi regime. Figures like Wernher von Braun, who would become a leading force behind the American space program, were quietly scrubbed of their pasts in exchange for their knowledge. While not part of the flight to Argentina, these instances showed how pragmatism could trump justice. Meanwhile, in Europe, thousands of Nazi collaborators used forged documents and sympathetic organizations to evade capture. The Vatican has long been accused of facilitating many of these escapes through unofficial channels. Priests and bishops sympathetic to anti-communist causes often viewed these fugitives as allies in a new ideological struggle against the Soviet Union. Using a network of monasteries, safe houses, and fake identities, this network became what many now refer to as the rat lines. South America, with its lenient immigration policies and large German-speaking populations, became a favored destination. Argentina, in particular, stood out. Under Juan Perón's leadership, Argentina positioned itself as a sanctuary for fleeing Nazis. Perón, along with his wife Eva, had sympathized with fascist ideologies and sought to elevate Argentina on the world stage by attracting elite professionals, regardless of their dark pasts. Documents declassified by the US and Argentine governments paint a complex picture. Nazi gold reportedly made its way to Argentina via Spanish intermediaries, funding relocation efforts and providing a financial cushion for new lives. Ships carrying hundreds of passengers disembarked in Buenos Aires, where immigrants vanished into cities, towns, and rural enclaves. Some changed their names. Others joined established German-speaking communities that offered anonymity and protection. Not all arrivals were low-level operatives. Notorious war criminals such as Josef Mengele and Adolf Eichmann lived comfortably in Argentina for years. Eichmann was finally tracked down by Israeli Mossad agents in 1960 and smuggled out of the country in a daring operation. Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, evaded capture for decades, eventually dying in Brazil. Their presence in South America lent credibility to the idea that other high-ranking Nazis, including Hitler himself, could have done the same. These historical facts laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most enduring conspiracy theories of the 20th century. With established rat lines, high-profile Nazi escapes, and a country actively welcoming fugitives, the stage was set. The question remained, if these men could vanish into the hills of Patagonia or the jungles of Brazil, who was to say that the most wanted man of all, Adolf Hitler, could not have done the same? The machinery was already in place, the corridors of escape already built, and the will to obscure the truth already deeply rooted in the political realities of a world bracing for the Cold War. At the heart of the Nazi flight theory lies a murky trail of figures whose names are far less familiar than Hitler's, but whose roles in post-war escape networks were critical. One of them was Otto Skorzeny, a former SS officer and one of the most decorated commandos in Nazi Germany. Known for his daring rescue of Benito Mussolini from imprisonment in 1943, Skorzeny would later be linked to various clandestine activities across Europe and South America. After the war, he escaped prosecution and surfaced in Spain under the protection of Franco's regime. From there, Skorzeny allegedly helped orchestrate safe passage for fellow Nazis fleeing justice. Another key figure was Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian cleric stationed in Rome. He openly sympathized with the Nazi cause and played a documented role in securing false identities and travel papers for former SS officers. Hudal's influence within the Vatican allowed him to shield many of these fugitives from prosecution by labeling them as political refugees. With forged Red Cross documents and travel passes blessed by sympathetic clergy, hundreds of war criminals found safe passage across the Atlantic. In Argentina, a man named Carlos Fuldner helped coordinate the arrival and assimilation of these exiles. Fuldner, a former SS captain, had strong ties to the Perón regime and used his influence to establish housing and employment for arriving Nazis. He secured jobs for them in various sectors, including the state-run airline and the national police. Through his network, fugitives could receive new names, new lives, and in many cases, a surprising degree of comfort. Bariloche, a town nestled in the Andes on the shores of Lake Nahuel Huapi, became one of the most heavily scrutinized locations in the theory. With its Alpine-style chalets, German schools, and large population of German immigrants, Bariloche looked like it had been transplanted from Bavaria. Tourists visiting the town even today remark on the distinctly European ambience, and it's here that many alleged sightings of Hitler were reported. One figure who stands out in these accounts is a mysterious man known only as Adolf Leipzig, described as a reclusive German who lived in the outskirts of Bariloche in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Locals claimed he bore a striking resemblance to Hitler and was often seen with former SS officers. While no official documents link Leipzig to the Führer, his presence has been the subject of several investigations, including those sparked by now declassified FBI reports. The FBI, for its part, did not dismiss these sightings outright. Between 1945 and 1956, the Bureau received and documented dozens of tips suggesting Hitler had escaped to Argentina. These files, some still partially redacted, contain maps, alleged locations of hideouts, and detailed accounts from individuals claiming to have seen Hitler in South America. While the FBI eventually closed the case citing lack of concrete evidence, the very existence of these reports has added a degree of credibility for believers in the theory. Further complicating matters is the curious story of the Estancia San Ramon, a massive ranch located just outside Bariloche. Once owned by German interests, the estate has long been rumoured to have served as a hideout for Nazi officials. Researchers and authors who have investigated the area point to the presence of fortified buildings, secret tunnels, and a main house built with remarkable security features. Though never officially linked to Hitler, the ranch remains a focal point for those convinced he lived out his final years in the Andes. The rumours and sightings don't end in Argentina. Chile, Paraguay, and Brazil all have their share of alleged Hitler encounters. In Brazil, a Polish nun in the 1980s swore she met an elderly German man named Adolf who confessed to being the former dictator. In Paraguay, former Nazi officers were reportedly seen meeting in secluded compounds. Even in Colombia, a declassified CIA report from 1955 mentions a conversation between agents about a man believed to be Hitler residing in the region under heavy protection. Individually, these stories might be dismissed as hearsay or mistaken identity, but together they paint a broader, more disturbing portrait, one in which the mechanisms of war did not stop with surrender, but simply changed form, evolving into a network of secrecy that allowed the most infamous war criminal of all time to vanish without a trace. Of all the documents unearthed in connection to the Nazi flight theory, none have sparked more debate than the declassified FBI memos regarding alleged post-war sightings of Adolf Hitler. Released decades after the war, these files detail reports from informants across Latin America who believed they had seen the former dictator. One particularly detailed account from 1947 describes a former SS officer guiding Hitler through the foothills near Argentina's border with Chile. The report includes hand-drawn maps, physical descriptions, and a breakdown of supposed security protocols guarding the area. While the FBI noted the information as unverified, it was documented and filed rather than discarded outright. Other reports came from commercial pilots, missionaries, and expatriates claiming they had encountered German-speaking communities that were unusually secretive and well-armed. In some cases, the descriptions of a man resembling Hitler were supported by sightings of other former Nazis living in proximity. One informant described visiting a remote estate where a man, referred to only as El Jefe, presided over dinner while his guests stood in attention. The man's face, she said, was unmistakably Hitler's. These claims were further energized by journalists and researchers such as Simon Dunstan and Gerard Williams, whose 2011 book and documentary Grey Wolf, The Escape of Adolf Hitler, reignited the public imagination. They presented interviews, satellite imagery, and alleged government documents suggesting Hitler fled Berlin via a secret Luftwaffe air corridor, boarded a U-boat, and arrived in Argentina months later. Their work outlined how Eva Braun may have lived with him under assumed names, raising children in the Patagonian wilderness. Central to their claim was the idea that Hitler's supposed remains, allegedly found by the Soviets in Berlin, could not be conclusively linked to him. For decades, the Soviet Union withheld the skull fragment said to belong to Hitler, showing it to no outside experts. In 2009, a team of American researchers, granted rare access to the fragment, conducted DNA tests and found that the bone belonged to a woman under 40. This fueled arguments that the Soviet evidence had been flawed from the start and that the real Hitler may have escaped before the Allies even reached Berlin. Further examination of Soviet records reveals contradictions. Statements from Red Army officers, Soviet scientists, and Stalin himself all vary. Stalin, in particular, was famously skeptical of Hitler's suicide. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, he told US Secretary of State James Burns that he believed Hitler had escaped, possibly to Spain or Argentina. Whether this was Cold War disinformation or a genuine concern remains uncertain, but it planted seeds of doubt that still linger today. In addition to inconsistencies in Soviet reporting, forensic gaps have emerged in Western reconstructions of Hitler's final moments. Eyewitness accounts from inside the bunker differ in details. Some claim the bodies were fully incinerated, others insist there were recognizable features. No universally accepted autopsy was ever completed on Hitler's remains. The reliance on testimonies from traumatized or ideologically motivated individuals further muddies the waters. These gaps in hard evidence created a perfect storm for speculation, and in that storm, the theory of Hitler's escape took on a life of its own. Authors, amateur sleuths, and even some former intelligence agents argued that Western powers may have intentionally allowed certain Nazi figures to disappear, seeing them as assets in the looming Cold War. Whether used as leverage, sources, or warnings, these individuals became shadows, absent from justice, but ever present in rumor. As these claims continued to circulate, modern forensic science attempted to close the case. But even with new technologies, many questions remained unanswered. If the remains in Soviet custody were misidentified and no autopsy had been conclusively performed, the foundation of the official story weakened. Skeptics pointed out that no photograph of Hitler's corpse was ever released, no international confirmation of his death was ever offered, and all evidence remained under tight Soviet control until the collapse of the USSR. Without clear, undeniable proof, the escape theory found fertile ground. Combined with the successful flights of Mengele and Eichmann, the narrative began to feel less like wild speculation and more like a plausible alternative to a story that, from the very beginning, had been clouded by war, secrecy, and geopolitical maneuvering. The figure of Hitler, rather than being closed within the walls of the Führer bunker, now seemed to stretch across oceans and borders, embedded in the very structure of post-war denial and manipulation. The notion that Hitler could have slipped through the grasp of Allied forces is deeply entwined with the broader skepticism surrounding post-war intelligence operations. After the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union prioritized strategic advantage over transparency, often at the expense of public truth. Intelligence agencies became gatekeepers of vast troves of classified information, some of which remains inaccessible to this day. Within this secretive landscape, the question of Hitler's death became not just a historical issue but a political one, shaped by agendas, misinformation, and a fierce competition for ideological dominance. For decades, the CIA maintained an interest in Nazi fugitives, including those believed to be hiding in South America. Declassified agency documents, some buried under layers of redaction, mention Adolf Hitler by name in connection with suspected sightings. One 1955 memo discusses a source who allegedly met Hitler in Colombia. Though the agency labelled the claim unreliable, the very existence of such documents demonstrates that intelligence agencies did not consider the matter entirely closed. These were not internet-age conspiracy theorists. They were government analysts and operatives who found enough cause to record and sometimes investigate such claims. Skeptics argue that had Hitler been alive, he would have likely been paraded by one side or the other as either a captured trophy or a symbolic enemy. But proponents of the escape theory suggest the opposite, that his survival would have been too politically dangerous to reveal. An exposed Hitler, alive and unrepentant, might have destabilized the fragile post-war order. Worse, it could have sparked a resurgence among Nazi sympathizers or undermined the legitimacy of the Allies' victory. Silence, they argue, was the most convenient form of control. This theory dovetails with long-standing beliefs about secret agreements and backroom deals. Some researchers propose that elements within the Allied powers may have struck quiet bargains with key Nazi figures, trading freedom for secrets, particularly intelligence on the Soviet Union. In this narrative, Hitler's survival is not just a matter of escape, but of calculated preservation, his life hidden as part of a broader intelligence apparatus designed to serve the Cold War's shifting priorities. Psychologically, the theory's endurance reveals something deeper about how societies process evil. For many, the official story of Hitler's suicide felt too clean, too swift, too unpunished. His crimes were monstrous in scale and scope. The idea that he simply disappeared behind a steel door and died by his own hand felt like a denial of justice. The escape theory, regardless of its factual basis, offers a form of emotional symmetry. Hitler did not escape justice, he only delayed it, living in fear and hiding until nature caught up with him. This psychological need for retribution also intersects with the human appetite for mystery. Just as people have questioned the deaths of other high-profile figures, Elvis, JFK, Princess Diana, the uncertainty surrounding Hitler's final hours invites similar speculation. The absence of a clear, universally accepted forensic trail has left space for these narratives to grow, flourish, and adapt across generations. The broader implications of this theory are not limited to Hitler himself. They extend to the fabric of post-war Western narratives. If Hitler did escape, it calls into question the effectiveness of Allied military intelligence, the honesty of Cold War governments, and the very foundation of modern European history. It forces a reckoning with uncomfortable possibilities, that the systems we trust to secure justice may have prioritized secrecy over accountability. More than 7 decades later, the story of Hitler's alleged escape has become a cultural symbol. It appears in documentaries, books, and even fictional portrayals. Each new account, credible or not, is absorbed into the larger mythology. The line between evidence and legend becomes increasingly blurred. What remains is not a single, clear narrative, but a constellation of clues, contradictions, and questions that continue to haunt the margins of history. In this unresolved space, the conspiracy endures, not simply as a fringe belief, but as a symptom of deeper truths about power, secrecy, and our desperate need to make sense of the unthinkable. Mainstream historians and forensic investigators have long held to the official account that Adolf Hitler died by suicide on April 30, 1945, in his Berlin bunker, alongside Eva Braun. This position is supported by testimonies from those inside the bunker, his valet, his personal aides, his doctor. According to their accounts, the couple retreated to their private room, and shortly afterward, the sound of a gunshot echoed through the bunker. Upon entering, aides claimed to find Hitler slumped on a blood-soaked sofa, a pistol in his hand, with Eva Braun beside him, having taken cyanide. The bodies were then hurriedly carried up to the garden and burned with petrol, as per Hitler's orders. Critics of the escape theory cite these testimonies, along with the logistical implausibility of a secret escape, as the most compelling evidence against it. They argue that with Berlin surrounded by Soviet troops and the city in a state of collapse, the chances of fleeing undetected were near zero. The Soviets controlled every exit. The bunker was under constant surveillance. No flights left Berlin after April 21st, and by the time of Hitler's reported death, the city had become a war zone. Furthermore, documents released from Soviet archives after the Cold War include autopsy reports and dental records. These records were compiled by Soviet forensic teams who claimed to have recovered and identified Hitler's remains. A key part of this identification came from Hitler's dental assistant, who reportedly confirmed that dental bridges and fillings found on the skull matched Hitler's known dental work. These findings, when compared with wartime dental charts, were used to conclude the identity beyond reasonable doubt. Still, skepticism persists, partly because the Soviets never released photographs of the remains, and partly due to their contradictory public statements. While one branch of the Soviet regime claimed to have positively identified Hitler's body, another, under Stalin's orders, pushed the narrative that Hitler had escaped. Some historians believe this was deliberate disinformation designed to sow confusion in the West during the early days of the Cold War. The result was a fractured narrative, confirmed death in private, ambiguous escape in public. Skeptics also challenged the logic of keeping Hitler alive. If the Soviets had captured or located him, why wouldn't they showcase him as a prize of war? For some, the answer lies in propaganda control. By fostering uncertainty around his fate, Stalin could manipulate public perception, keeping fear alive while undermining the confidence of Western powers. But to most scholars, the notion that Hitler lived undetected for decades strains credulity. Even DNA testing has weighed in on the matter. In 2000, French pathologists examined fragments of what was claimed to be Hitler's jawbone, held in Moscow's archives. Their analysis reportedly confirmed its authenticity through dental comparison. Yet questions remain about chain of custody and the possibility of substitution. For believers in the escape theory, the lack of independently verifiable testing is enough to keep doubt alive. Most historians dismiss the escape theory as a combination of Cold War paranoia, misidentification, and public fascination with unsolved mysteries. They point to the consistency of eyewitness accounts, the practical impossibility of fleeing Berlin, and the lack of hard evidence placing Hitler in South America. To them, the theory is a distraction from deeper investigations into the regime's atrocities and the global network that protected real, known war criminals. Nonetheless, the persistence of the theory reveals how powerful gaps in knowledge can become. The lack of definitive public proof, the absence of a body, the secrecy of Soviet findings, the conflicting reports, creates a vacuum where conspiracy thrives. It is within this vacuum that imagination takes over, fueled by fear, trauma, and a lingering belief that evil does not simply disappear. For every piece of evidence that seeks to close the case, another fragment of mystery slips through the cracks, keeping the theory alive, not as fact, but as possibility. The psychological gravity of Hitler's presence in global memory cannot be overstated. His name, actions, and ideology carved a scar across the 20th century, and even decades after his supposed death, his figure casts a long, cold shadow. The theory that he may have escaped and lived on in secret speaks to more than just suspicion. It touches something primal in the human psyche. It suggests unresolved justice, unfinished history, and the chilling possibility that evil is never truly buried. The appeal of the theory goes beyond the question of his physical fate. It functions as a lens through which larger doubts are projected, about governments, power, and truth itself. For many, it's not about whether Hitler escaped, but whether we can ever really trust what we're told. In a world where history is often shaped by those who win wars or write policy, the lines between record and reality blur. The Hitler escape narrative has become a vehicle for these anxieties, growing more potent with each newly declassified memo or contradictory testimony. Culturally, the theory has embedded itself in countless forms of media. From books to television specials, podcasts to docuseries, the idea of a fugitive Führer in Patagonia has become a recurring character in the modern mythos. Each retelling reanimates the question, sometimes with new evidence, other times with dramatized reenactments. Even when presented skeptically, these portrayals keep the story alive. They make it tangible, and they reach audiences who may not read academic history, but consume stories through spectacle. In Argentina and Chile, the theory has even become part of tourism. Guided tours in Bariloche and surrounding towns highlight former German compounds, allegedly Nazi-friendly hotels, and even supposed escape routes through the Andes. Some are rooted in actual history, tied to the verifiable presence of former SS officers. Others lean heavily into speculation, turning rumours into destinations. While some local communities push back against this commercialization of fascist history, others profit from the mystery it generates. The continued interest also reveals how conspiracy theories offer a kind of psychological order. They allow people to impose narrative structure on chaos. The horror of Hitler's actions is hard to process. That he could simply vanish in a blaze, his body burned beyond recognition, seems narratively unsatisfying. A hidden exile growing old in the shadows offers a more poetic, if unsettling, symmetry. It transforms him from a distant monster into an ongoing threat, one that didn't end with the war but simply went underground. This symbolic power mirrors how societies process other traumatic figures. Think of Jack the Ripper, whose unknown identity haunts London's streets more than a century later, or the persistent speculation around JFK's assassination. In each case, uncertainty breeds obsession. When evil lacks a final chapter, it lingers. It becomes part of the collective subconscious, a haunting echo that refuses to be silenced. In some academic circles, the Hitler escape theory is studied not for its factual merit, but for what it reveals about our collective need for moral closure. Psychologists have noted how conspiracy theories can act as coping mechanisms in the face of overwhelming trauma. For the post-war generation, a theory that suggested Hitler's story wasn't over yet may have been more bearable than believing he escaped judgment entirely through death. It kept the hunt alive. It made justice feel possible, even if only hypothetically. As the decades pass and World War II fades into history, the endurance of this theory reflects more than distrust or historical curiosity. It reflects a culture that, even now, is still trying to reconcile the magnitude of what happened and is still searching for meaning in the unanswered silence left behind. The notion of Hitler's escape is less about a man and more about the ghosts we carry when justice feels incomplete. The legacy of the Hitler escape theory is not confined to the shadows of post-war Europe or the hills of Argentina. Its ripple effects have extended far beyond the question of whether one man lived or died. It has shaped media narratives, influenced public discourse, and fueled a culture of conspiracy that continues to thrive in the digital age. From early radio broadcasts to present-day streaming platforms, the idea that Hitler may have survived has been recycled, repackaged and reintroduced to new generations under the guise of investigation, entertainment or revelation. In the decades following the war, television programs in the United States and Europe regularly flirted with the theory. Documentaries aired on major networks featured reenactments, supposed eyewitnesses, and dramatic narration set to ominous music. Magazine covers asked provocative questions: was Hitler really dead, or the Führer in the Andes? Each time the story resurfaced, it reactivated public imagination, regardless of scholarly pushback. Even when the intention was to debunk, the coverage ensured the theory remained in circulation. More recently, major streaming services have capitalized on this ongoing fascination. Series like Hunting Hitler, produced with former military and intelligence personnel, retrace possible escape routes and investigate reported safe houses. Though these programs often conclude without definitive evidence, they introduce viewers to patterns of behavior, geopolitical maneuvers, and real post-war operations that add texture to the myth. Whether or not the audience walks away convinced, they are exposed to a version of history that suggests far more was happening beneath the surface than textbooks reveal. The internet has supercharged this phenomenon. Conspiracy forums, video essays, YouTube channels, and TikTok creators continue to dissect old photographs, analyze grainy footage, and speculate on declassified files. AI-generated images now circulate purporting to show Hitler in exile, blurring the lines between fiction and archival material. In online echo chambers, evidence becomes secondary to engagement. The most emotionally gripping version of the story tends to rise, regardless of its veracity. This shift has created a media environment where historical certainty is often drowned out by sensationalism. In such a landscape, the Hitler escape theory becomes more than a fringe curiosity. It becomes part of a broader erosion of trust in official accounts. Alongside other popular conspiracies, it reinforces a worldview in which hidden powers manipulate reality, governments routinely lie, and nothing is ever as it seems. For some, this skepticism becomes an identity. For others, it's a gateway to more dangerous ideologies. Academics and historians have expressed growing concern over how such theories, once regarded as harmless speculation, now bleed into the mainstream. When Holocaust denial, revisionist history, and fascist nostalgia begin to masquerade as alternative investigation, the danger becomes clear. The myth of Hitler's escape in these cases is not just about the man, it's about rehabilitating the idea. If Hitler lived, some argue, then maybe he wasn't as defeated, as discredited, or as monstrous as history has judged. This is why the theory's persistence matters. It is not merely a historical curiosity. It plays a role in how societies remember, how they question, and how they process moral failure. It serves as both a mirror and a mask, reflecting cultural unease while concealing deeper anxieties about truth, accountability, and legacy. In this way, the story of Hitler's alleged flight becomes less about verifying a set of facts and more about understanding how modern narratives are shaped, sold, and sustained in a world where history is never fully settled. As media continues to evolve, so too will the forms this theory takes. Virtual reality, deepfakes, and increasingly sophisticated AI-generated content will make it harder to distinguish between documented history and digital folklore. And in this new reality, where attention often outweighs accuracy, the ghosts of the past find fertile ground, not in the facts we uncover, but in the stories we choose to believe. Among the more fringe yet persistent branches of the Hitler escape theory are those that stretch the narrative into realms of near fiction, stories that depart from verifiable history and step into speculative territory, fueled by paranoia, symbolism, and myth. These ideas often blend bits of truth with elaborate imagination, creating a tapestry of claims that are difficult to disprove, yet impossible to confirm. They thrive on ambiguity, exploiting the same gaps and inconsistencies that have kept the core theory alive for decades. One of the most provocative of these fringe theories involves the alleged existence of a secret Nazi enclave in Antarctica. Referred to in conspiracy circles as Base 211 or New Swabia, the story claims that during the late 1930s, Nazi Germany conducted secret expeditions to Antarctica, establishing an underground base beneath the ice. Proponents argue that as the war neared its end, high-ranking Nazis, including Hitler, were evacuated to this hidden fortress, where they continued their operations in secrecy, shielded by advanced technology and the desolate environment. The theory is bolstered by real events, such as Germany's 1938 to 1939 expedition to Antarctica, during which they claimed a portion of the continent as Neuschwabenland. Though this expedition was largely scientific and exploratory in nature, conspiracy theorists reinterpret it as the groundwork for a long-term Nazi presence. They point to Allied interest in Antarctica after the war, particularly Operation High Jump, a large-scale US Navy mission in 1946-1947, as evidence that the Allies were attempting to confront or investigate this hidden threat. In these speculative narratives, Antarctica becomes a stage for otherworldly ideas. Some versions claim that the Nazis, having escaped, developed anti-gravity craft or reverse-engineered alien technology, giving rise to the myth of Nazi UFOs. These stories often merge with ancient alien theories, suggesting that remnants of the Third Reich made contact with extraterrestrial beings and disappeared into the ice with secret knowledge. While mainstream science and history dismiss these claims outright, their inclusion in popular media has helped embed them into modern conspiracy culture. Another fringe idea suggests that Hitler didn't merely survive but underwent a complete transformation, spiritual, psychological, or even biological. These stories imagine him being protected and reprogrammed by secret cabals or rogue intelligence factions, used as a symbol or puppet within deeper schemes. In these tellings, Hitler becomes less a man and more a mythic cipher, an embodiment of evil that is never truly defeated, only hidden and repurposed. These theories are often rooted in a broader distrust of global institutions, tying Hitler's supposed survival to alleged plots by the Illuminati, Freemasons, or secret world governments. Brazil also features prominently in these fringe versions. In a widely publicized 2014 claim, Brazilian researchers argued that Hitler lived in the state of Mato Grosso under the name Adolf Leipzig, marrying a local woman and dying in 1984. A photo surfaced of an elderly man bearing a vague resemblance to Hitler, and though most experts quickly dismissed the evidence as laughably thin, the story spread quickly across tabloids and conspiracy websites. For believers, even the thinnest thread was enough to keep the idea alive. What's striking about these speculative offshoots is their resilience. Despite lacking credible sources or forensic backing, they continue to captivate. They draw strength not from proof, but from possibility, from the idea that the world's darkest figures might not only survive but thrive in the shadows, protected by the very systems meant to prevent their return. These theories function as cultural cautionary tales, warnings wrapped in fantasy. They offer no resolution, only the suggestion that beneath the surface of accepted history, deeper currents still churn. The theory that Adolf Hitler escaped and lived out his days in secret has never been definitively proven, nor has it been fully dismissed in the minds of many. What remains is a fragmented mosaic of facts, testimonies, classified memos, forensics, fabrications, and decades of speculation. In the absence of irrefutable evidence, the narrative continues to evolve, not as a single theory, but as a cultural phenomenon, shaped by the fears, doubts, and imaginations of generations seeking resolution for a wound that never quite healed. From the bunker in Berlin to the ranches of Argentina, from the dark archives of Soviet intelligence to the high-altitude mythos of Antarctica, this story has been carried across continents and decades. Each version of the theory reflects not only on Hitler's fate, but on the collective uncertainties of the post-war world. It speaks to a time when ideologies clashed in secret, when justice was often delayed or distorted, and when the line between truth and propaganda was nearly impossible to define. The physical evidence that once might have ended the debate remains, autopsy reports, witness statements, has been weakened by time, conflicting reports, and restricted access. The Soviet Union's control over Hitler's alleged remains, combined with their early contradictions and refusal to share information with the West, planted a seed of mistrust that still blooms today. And even the later forensic confirmations are questioned due to chain of custody concerns and lack of independent verification. Meanwhile, the verified escapes of other Nazis, Eichmann, Mengele, and hundreds more, prove beyond doubt that powerful war criminals did flee and rebuild their lives elsewhere. That knowledge has provided fertile ground for those who believe Hitler could have done the same. The logistics of such a plan would have been enormous, but not impossible, especially in a world upended by war, where powerful institutions were more focused on future threats than past justice. The conspiracy's longevity has made it more than a historical question. It's become a story about how we process evil, how we trust authority, and how we deal with ambiguity. It reflects a human desire for narrative justice, the need to know, without question, that the architect of such monstrous atrocities met a definitive end. When that clarity is absent, the vacuum draws in theories, and those theories become mirrors of our own doubts and unease. Today, the theory survives not because of new proof, but because of the nature of belief itself. In a world where information is infinite and trust is fractured, uncertainty is no longer a flaw in the system. It is the system. And within that uncertainty, myths like the Hitler escape theory find permanence. Not because they are true, but because they remain unresolved. They become part of a cultural memory that refuses to close the book. Perhaps in the end, the most haunting aspect of this theory isn't whether Hitler lived or died in 1945. It's that even now, almost a century later, his presence can still shape the stories we tell, the truths we question, and the ghosts we keep alive. Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of Conspiracy Theories and Cover-Ups. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to support the show, subscribe to Conspiracy Theories Podcast on Spotify. Subscribe now.